Good evening, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon to those following us from transatlantic regions, because we do have some guests from the United States and Canada here as well. A warm welcome to the audience. It's a great pleasure to see about 50 or more people tonight here, or in this morning. It depends on where you are, from different countries and continents. I'd like first to ask you kindly to turn off your webcams and microphones during the presentation. You may, of course, activate them afterwards to ask questions and make comments during our discussion. It is also possible to use the chat tool, obviously, to contribute to the discussion which is to follow. We will do a recording of the talk and the little chiacchierata colloquium in which I myself will try to engage with our speaker, but the following public discussion will not be recorded. Especially warm welcome, obviously, to Gur Zak, tonight's speaker, who is currently senior research fellow in the Cluster of Excellence, Temporal Communities, within the frame of our research area, One Competing Communities. I think we all remember his quite impressive talk he gave at the grand opening of our cluster. Gur Zak studied in Tel Aviv and Toronto, where he completed in 2008 his formative academic career in medieval studies with a PhD thesis on, quote, writing from exile, Petrarch's Humanism and the ethics of care of the self, under the supervision of Professor Brian Stock. Gur was lecturer and is now senior lecturer at the Department of General and Comparative Literature at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he also served as chair to his department for several years. He is a specialist on Italian and Latin literature of the early modern period. In particularly, I guess, interested, I could say, in the relations between literature on the one hand and moral philosophy, also theology on the other hand, concentrating on issues like the ethics of compassion and affectivity. Among his most, I guess, important publications must be ranked his book entitled Petrarch's Humanism and the Care of the Self, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010 and re-edited as a paperback 4 years later. There's a quite impressive series of reviews by prominent people on this book, which you might easily find by a Google research. To be very brief, I'd like to mention just two other quite characteristic publications by our speaker, and that would be perhaps his article of 2016 with the title The Ethics and Poetics of Consolation in Petrarch's Bucolicum Carmen, and another text, Modes of Self-Writing from Antiquity to the Later Middle Ages, published in 2012. Gur is also working on fundamental questions concerning literary and cultural periodization. Suffice it to quote a volume of the European Legacy, which he co-edited in 2015 with the title Renaissance Humanism and the Ambiguities of Modernity. He also wrote substantial contributions to the Cambridge Companion to Boccaccio, the Cambridge Companion to Petrarch, and many other things. I'm closing this list right now and in this moment, saying that Gur is the perfect fellow for our project, Petrarchan Worlds, in the context of the cluster's research area, Competing Communities. Why is that so? I mean, Petrarchan Worlds as a project is concerned with the strategies of the building of intellectual communities in the early modern period, looking especially at tensions between divergent, antithetical, precisely competing communities. These strategies are founded by Francis Petrarch himself, a well-known master in self-centered communication with trans-regional, transnational, translinguistic, and even trans-temporal groups of human beings. Petrarch pursues the goals of his strategy in a number of different types of texts, including obviously his letters, but also dialogues like his self-reflective, self-analytical Secretum Meum, My Secret. He, Petrarch, is well aware of his own intentions to create a network of post-Petrarchan and Petrarchistic followers who would resume his conceptions and create or recreate a new type of a more or less post-medieval intellectual society. Among these followers, we find a very particular author like Giovanni Conversini da Ravenna. Many scholars, I would guess, of Petrarchism know his name only or mainly from the question which Giovanni had a close working relationship to Petrarch himself. Giovanni Malpagini, or precisely Giovanni da Ravenna. It will have been Giovanni Malpagini, even though we are not anymore so sure about the fact that Giovanni Malpagini might really have been il copista who wrote out extensive parts of Petrarch's Canzoniere after the studies by Monica Berthet, with whom we will have another presentation in December. Anyway, there is much to discover in Giovanni Conversini's textual universe, and I am personally really very grateful to Gur for having disclosed this world to me. Tonight, he is going to disclose it to others as well. Gur, thank you so much for this initiative. The virtual floor is now yours, and of course, Giovanni's. Grazie.
Okay, thank you. Grazie, Bernhard. Thank you for this very kind and generous introduction. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. And actually, if you can open the cameras, as far as I'm concerned, it would be better. I mean, I want to see all of you and get the reactions from the audience, and imagine that we are in an auditorium and having a conversation. So thank you.
As long as the system won't break down, I'm completely satisfied with that.
Yeah. And yeah, so this is all new. I mean, for all of us, I'm sure, and for me, to give a talk from my living room. And I hope my dog will be quiet and everything will work and the internet won't fall down. So let's hope that everything will be okay. So I will share now my PowerPoint, and let's see. Do you see the image?
It's loading up.
We good?
Yes.
Good.
Just activate it and then you can go on, I think.
Is it activated or?
Yeah, now we see the whole PowerPoint screen. You just can run it. So, okay.
Okay, perfect. So, welcome and thank you for joining us for this all-night event. And I have to thank again Bernhard, Professor Bernhard Huss, and I have the Italian Center at the Free University of Berlin and the Cluster of Excellence Temporal Communities for inviting me to be part of this really exciting scholarly community and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Well, I was supposed to be in Berlin now, but unfortunately, due to the current global situation, I was unable to do it. But thankfully, technology has given me the opportunity to pursue my fellowship and conduct this talk online, creating thereby really a true virtual or global community, right? So we are enliving the idea of the cluster now. We have here participants from Germany, Israel, the US, Italy, and for me personally, it's very exciting to see friends from all over the world. So, as Bernhard mentioned, my talk today will concentrate on a rather, I think, neglected figure of early Italian humanism, Giovanni Conversini da Ravenna, and especially on his striking autobiography, the Rationarium vite, the first full-length autobiography written in the Latin West after Augustine Confessions. And this is a remarkable fact, I think. My aim in this presentation will be to demonstrate the significance of the Rationarium, the culture of early Italian humanism, By examining it in light of Petrarch's autobiographical writings, and especially Petrarch's revival of the ancient concept of the care of the self. And this, as Bernhard mentioned, goes back to the topic of my first book, which I'm now returning to, slowly returning to after a detour in Boccaccio. So in Conversini Rationarium, I will argue, we receive a central example of the impact of the Petrarchan notion of care on early Italian humanism, a notion that goes to the heart of humanist ethics and conception of subjectivity. My talk will begin with a brief introduction of the Petrarchan concept of self-care, and will then turn to a close analysis of Conversini's appropriation of it in the Rationarium. However, given that Conversini, as I mentioned, is not a well-known humanist, I think that a few introductory remarks are in place. So let's begin with a brief biography. So Conversini was born in Buda, Hungary in 1343, where his father served as a physician at the court of King Louis. His mother passed away while he was an infant, and he was sent back to Italy to the care of his uncle, the Franciscan theologian and future cardinal Tommaso da Frignano. With the support of his uncle, Conversini studied under several humanist schoolmasters, including the well-known Donato degli Albanzani, the close friend of both Boccaccio and Petrarch, and it was in fact Albanzani who introduced the young Conversini to Petrarch in Venice in 1364. Much like Petrarch, Conversini was an itinerant humanist for most of his life, serving as schoolmaster in various North Italian cities. In 1393, he became Chancellor of Padua, then under the rule of Francesco da Carrara the Younger. He was married twice, had several children, about 2 of whom died young, and suffered from apparent poverty at various stages of his life. He wrote several notable works, including the loosely Ovid-inspired dialogue between Giovanni and a letter, which is basically an homage, a biography of his uncle, the political treatise Dragmalogia, the Eligibili Vita Genere, and the history of the Carrara family. Conversini died in 1408. Conversini composed his autobiography, the Rationarium Vitae, in 1399-1400, 8 years, that is, before his death. In this work, he offers an elaborate account of his life, from birth to his present miserable condition following the death of 2 of his children. The narrative is lengthy, very vivid, at times even bawdy, and is interspersed with long moral reflections on topics of interest to Renaissance humanists, such as the opening discussion of the nature of true nobility. The editor of the Latin text, Vittore Nasson, whom I think is with us today, and we were very fortunate to have the editor of the text with us. So the editor, Nasson, pointed to the crude realism that often characterizes Conversini's prose style. And indeed, alongside the obvious influence of Petrarch, Boccaccio's Decameron clearly had a deep impact on Conversini. And within the work, Conversini offers 2 very lengthy novelle in which he describes his sexual exploits as a young man. And these novelle are really read like they're taken from the pages of the Decameron. So this is very interesting, this stylistic mix of Petrarch humanist Latin and Boccaccio's Volgare. So the work is notable for various reasons and may be examined from many different perspectives. In this presentation, as already noted, I would like to explore especially Conversini's adherence within the work to the Petrarchan revival of the ancient concept of the care of the self. And let me say a few words about this feature. My analysis of the humanist self-care draws upon Pierre Hadot's and Michel Foucault's work on the care of the self in the ancient world. In his influential studies, the French philosopher Hadot argued that ancient philosophy was not a theoretical and abstract body of knowledge, but a way of life, a system of living based on spiritual exercises. Foucault developed those ideas in his later writings and seminars, showing how in ancient Roman culture, the concern with the self was a central ethical predicament. Men, particularly from the elite, were expected to perform exercises upon themselves so as to constitute themselves as subjects. For Foucault, this concern with the self in late antiquity offered an alternative conception of both ethics and subjectivity to those usually espoused in the modern world. The self, according to this conception, is not a given object of knowledge, but rather a product of continuing cultivation and care. And ethics, at the same time, is not primarily involved with the relation of self and others, but rather first and foremost with one's concern with oneself, and only then one's relation to others. In my monograph that Bernhard mentioned, Petrarch's Humanism and the Care of the Self, I argue that Petrarch was an important heir of this tradition, as he revived the ancient ideal of the care of the self as a cornerstone of his humanist ethics. As he declared in letter 19 of the Familiares, animi cura, the care of the soul, is the central task of the man of letters. This revival of the ancient concept of care is evident not only in Petrarch's frequent allusions to the need to care for oneself in his works, but also in his assertion of the value of ancient texts for such care, as well as in his return to various ancient techniques of care. In letter 15:6 of the Seniles, written to the Augustinian monk Luigi Marsili, for example, Petrarch exhorts his addressee to care for himself and evokes the ancient Stoic practice of daily self-examinations to that end. As Petrarch writes, and you have here on the slide, you can read the Latin above if you want. I will read the English, the translation below. So Petrarch tells Marsili in this passage, quite striking passage, he tells him, rouse yourself and examine your days one by one. Take care that no day passes without us sifting through it and reflecting upon ourselves. For how will we be able to care for other matters if we neglect ourselves? And the last sentence is, quam modo enim aliena curabimus si nostra negligimus. This statement closely recalls Seneca's exhortations to perform such internal self-examinations of conscience. For example, in the opening of letter 83 of the Moral Letters to Lucilius. And Seneca writes, I shall keep watching myself continually, and a most useful habit shall review each day. For this is what makes us wicked, that no one of us looks back over his own life. Petrarch's many autobiographical letters on his own condition, the stato suo, in which he carefully reviews his everyday activities and habits, may be seen as his own enactment of the Senecan precepts. And of course, I think this is a statement, that the Seneca statement inheres behind his admonition to Marsili to conduct such daily self-examinations. While reviving the ancient concept of care, the Petrarchan self-care, as Brian Stock has observed, also had strong affinities with the writings of Augustine and the monastic reform movements of the later Middle Ages, such as the Cistercians or the Carthusians, of course. Yet Petrarch also departed from this medieval tradition in crucial ways. First, his concern with the self did not involve a complete withdrawal from the secular world, but rather took place within it. And second, the goals of his self-care, I argue, were much more classical than Augustinian monastic in nature. Look, for example, at the confessional writings of an author like Augustine. It is clear that the main aim behind the self-examination is the excavation of guilt in the attempt to disavow attachment to one's earthly and sinful self. As Augustine writes in the beginning of Book of the Confessions, a very famous passage, I wish to recall my past foulness and the carnal corruptions of my soul, not because I love them, but so that I may love you, my God. In his own self-examinations, including in his imaginary dialogue with the scepter of Augustine in the Secretum, Petrarch is concerned much less with Augustinian self-reproach than with a Stoic-like effort to develop his control over the passions, turning thereby a sense of autonomy from outer constraints and inner passions. As the figure of Augustinus tells Franciscus in Book 2 of the Secretum, and you have it here, you will know that you have finally cut off this yoke, and you're referring to the yoke of fortune, when, having scorned human passions, you have submitted fully to the rule of virtue. From then on you will be free, needing nothing, subject to no human being. Rather than self-negation, Petrarch is therefore concerned with self-formation, secularizing thereby in significant ways the Augustinian monastic tradition of care. So let's turn now to Conversini, Rationarium, and its dialogue with Petrarch. My discussion of the Rationarium now will concentrate on three central features relating to the care of the self in the work. The first will be Conversini's use of autobiographical writing as a technique of care. The second will be Conversini's adherence to Petrarch's view of self-care as a mode of social critique. And the third section will focus on Conversini's oscillation between two ideals of selfhood and two distinct ends of care, namely Stoic self-control on the one hand and Franciscan emotionality on the other, and we'll get to it, to what exactly I mean by that later. So first, the Rationarium as a practice of care. Conversini's adherence to the Petrarchan project of self-care is evident from the very opening statement of the Rationarium. And you have the original from Masson's edition on top, and I will read that translation. This is my translations, and I have to share with you that when I started to work on Conversini, it was several years ago, and one of my dear friends and mentors, Professor Ronald Witt, who unfortunately died a few years ago, he told me that Conversini's Latin is unbearable, so I should beware of that. and he's right. Anyway, so this is my translation. I'm reading. What is the purpose, little man, of all this continuous work? Until when will you occupy yourself with matters of others and never with yourselves? You desire to study the deeds of the ancients and to hear about the events of the present. But are you truly willing to waste your time on the care of external things and never of yourself? Listen for once to the harsh voice of your exactor. Rise, little servant, and give me an account of your transactions. Conversini's Rationarium begins, as the statement makes clear, with an internal dialogue in which the author urges himself to stop wasting his time on caring for other matters and begin to care for his own self. And the terminology is precisely the same terminology of care, cura tua. Such internal dialogue evokes directly Petrarch's Secretum. And indeed, the opening sentence of the Rationarium, quodio turnus iste labor omuntio, as Masson points out, closely echoes the opening of part 1 of the Secretum. What do you have to say for yourself, frail human, quid agis omuntio? So just like Petrarch, Conversini posits the care of the self as a central ethical predicament and states that this care should take place through the very writing of the Rationarium. Such writing, as Conversini adds very little later, will reveal to him his shortcomings and will allow him to shape himself accordingly. And this is quite a striking statement. Write so that you may read, so that what you read, you may correct. What you correct, you may love, and what you love, you may follow. So Conversini really describes here a process when he writes down his experiences, his shortcomings, and then rereading what he wrote and internalizing what needs to be corrected. And the writing of the autobiography in this respect clearly functions as a type of what Pierre Hadot described as a spiritual exercise. While evoking Petrarch, Conversini's opening statements also direct our attention to the strong Augustinian underpinnings of his written self-examination. The call to provide rationem vilicationis, an account of your transactions, echoes Augustine's intention to recall transactas fedelitatis meas, my past foulness, through the writing of the Confessions. Indeed, Conversini's choice to examine his whole life in a linear continuum is much closer to Augustine's use of self-writing than to Petrarch's, formally I mean much closer. Petrarch, as we know, never offered a full linear account of his life. As he stated in letter 41 of the Familiares, the famous ascent of Mount Ventoux, as long as he is subjected to his worldly passions, he cannot securely recall the narrative of his past. Petrarch's self-writing, as a result, consisted of fragments, letters, poems, dialogues, which were aimed, at least in part, to allow him to attain such complete self-control, to no avail. Conversini, although never claiming for a complete conversion from worldly passions like Augustine, still chooses to examine the entire arc of his life in a linear continuum, and in this sense, it brings together the Petrarchan ideal of self-care with the Augustinian confessional narrative. Conversini's double allegiance to both Petrarch and Augustine is reflected in the nature and goals of his written self-examination. On the one hand, Conversini often describes the goal of self-cultivation in specific Stoic terms, emphasizing the need to develop control over the passions. And this sounds very Petrarchan. And for example, from chapter 2, read the translation, those people are justly called heroes or semigods, given that virtue is considered heroic when it manages not only to control the passions, but also to abolish all harmful thoughts to such a degree that it brings forth full tranquility of soul, tranquillitate animi. It is to this Stoic-like goal that he likely aims his writing in the statement quoted above from the beginning of the work, when he declares that he wishes to write down so that he may then reread and correct his mistakes. On the other hand, over the course of the narrative, Conversini often recalls the Augustinian confession, no doubt, as he repeatedly addresses God in the second person, reveals in minute detail his susceptibility to sins, and scolds himself for his weaknesses. For example, in one of his frequent references to the sin of anger, to which he was ostensibly especially vulnerable, anger is a sin and a passion that repeatedly comes up in the Rationarium. So at one place he writes, what happened here? Okay. This is chapter 43. With the vice of anger, I have so contaminated the outstanding gifts you have given me, my God, that I was inflamed by the slightest reasons. Often, in fits of anger, I destroyed objects within the house, so that I was justly considered foolish and insane. This confession comes within a lengthy chapter in which he narrates how after his uncle became the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, he invited Conversini to serve as part of his entourage. Joining the uncle household, Conversini soon felt that he was sidelined by the uncle's personal assistant, Vittore. His rage at his uncle for this fact was so intense that he contemplated murdering him, planning to stab the uncle to death in his bedchamber at night. This intention, however, was averted at the last minute by what he sees as a divine intervention. But your mercy, my God, saved me from such impious act, so that I did not sully my hands with the blood of a priest, making me responsible for a hideous sacrilege. You guided my anxious spirits to the better, so that I am now abhorred even by the recollection of such impious crime. And one thing that is really striking about this text is places like this where Conversini is so revealing, I mean, and willing himself to be vulnerable and open about his shortcomings, in confessing to really planning to murder his uncle and things like that. So while this confession of anger clearly has strong Augustinian dimension and reads like excavation of guilt, it may also be considered as an attempt to reflect on his passion so as to realize its danger and develop a measure of control over it, just as is stated in the beginning of the work. So while adhering to the Petrarchan ideal of self-care, Conversini's use of self-writing as a practice of care oscillates between and possibly strives to bring together Augustinian type of self-negation and Stoic Petrarchan self-formation. And I'm turning now to the second part of my analysis on self-care as social critique. The self-examination that Conversini enacts through the writing of the Rationarium is only one aspect of the care of the self that emerges from the work. Over the course of the Rationarium, Conversini refers to various other features of such care in which he was engaged throughout his life, features which again closely recall Petrarch. These features include the avid pursuit of solitude, often in a natural setting, solitude which allowed him, as he tells us, to disengage from society for a while, immerse himself in activities such as studies and prayer. And of course, there is nothing, I guess, more Petrarchan than this love of solitude. Conversini often refers to his scholarly activities as themselves a type of care. When describing his decision to quit his legal studies and dedicate himself to letters, he specifically refers to the study of letters as a means of self-cultivation. As he writes, whereas the science of law is concerned with honors and riches, letters cultivate the inner spirit. And I'm reading now the quotation you have here from chapter 26. While I was seeking to follow the path of a science that is much closer to the flesh than to the spirit, through which I would have become rich and therefore honored, your gift, my God, turned me with all my powers to the study of letters. These studies were the joy of my spirit. Through them I became better and more in control of myself. In addition to the studies, Conversini's professed asceticism, revealed in his avoidance of lavish clothing, to which he returns often, and fancy meals, may also be considered as part of his commitment to self-care. This emphasis on self-care within the Rationarium does not indicate only a concern with the self and an attempt to turn one's back on the world. Rather, just as in the case of Petrarch, Conversini's care of the self also has a public, even political dimension. It would not be an exaggeration to refer to it as a type of dissent, a way to withdraw from contemporary society in order to critique it. Within the Rationarium, Conversini repeatedly criticizes the society of his day for its degenerated morals and presents his own ascetic way of life as an alternative. While directing his critique towards almost all the institutions of his day, the church, the courts, the legal profession, he reserves his most poignant critique to the Franciscan order, of which his uncle, as noted, was the highest ranking official. So at one point, for example, Conversini describes the sumptuous dinners that his Franciscan uncle used to throw on behalf of his revered guests. I heard my uncle asking what kind of dishes would be served to the table of his guests when he came to realize that they were less copious than he considered appropriate to the dignity of his guests or the magnitude of his soul. Inflamed, he ordered the dinner will be prepared from the beginning. And you have here a portrait of the uncle. At another place, he describes how when he came to visit his uncle at the papal court in Rome, both the papal secretary and his uncle looked down upon him because of his simple clothes. His uncle, according to Conversini, was especially concerned that his nephew's poor outfit would damage the uncle's reputation. In response to the criticism, Conversini wryly asserts that he came to Rome to care for his soul, not to make a show of his appearance. I came to dissolve my sins by weeping at the altars of the apostles, not for pomp. Conversini's ascetic way of life and engagement in the care of the self thus provides him with a position and authority from which to criticize his debased society, presenting his own morals as an alternative. Conversini's brand of humanism, which followed directly upon Petrarch's, shares in this respect strong features with the monastic reform movements of the later Middle Ages, which were similarly bent on social critique, such as the Valdensians or the spiritual Franciscans. At the same time, unlike these movements, the humanist critique clearly never became heterodox. Their aim was not in any way overturning contemporary institutions, but rather reforming them through the correction of individual morals. For Petrarch and Conversini, the path to change inhered in the care of the self, not in social revolution. To be sure, while he was writing the Rationarium at around 1399-1400, Conversini was deeply engaged in the vita activa, as he served at the time as counselor at the court of the Carrara in Padua. And this is a position he bitterly laments he has taken, and in general, he is lamenting throughout the text. Anyway, so in this sense, the emphasis on solitude and concern with the self within the work may be seen from this perspective as a form of compensation for his real-life actions, even as hypocrisy, a charge that is often directed in contemporary scholarship at Petrarch's own writings on solitude and asceticism. Yet, even if Conversini did not live up to all of his ideals and was not entirely and consistently committed to his vision of self-care, the image of himself he is interested in presenting and the ideals of living he puts forth, I think, are still quite significant. And now I turn to the third section. Internal tensions, such as the one surrounding Conversini's commitment to solitude and the vita contemplativa, abound in the Rationarium. In the first section of this analysis, I touched upon the oscillation between Augustinian and Stoic Petrarchan notions of care as they relate to his written self-examination. In this section, the final one, I would like to discuss another crucial tension, which again relates to Conversini's views of the ends of self-care. That between the idealization of Stoic self-control on the one hand and exaltation of Franciscan-like compassion and softness on the other. This tension has in the work strong gendered undertones and also relates to the conflict between classical and contemporary, and to an extent Latin and vernacular cultures. The idealization of compassion as an essential human trait was, of course, a central feature of Franciscan writings in the later Middle Ages. In a recent study, Affective Meditation and the Invention of Medieval Compassion, Sarah McNamara has demonstrated this centrality and argued that compassion emerged in Franciscan circles as a particularly female trait. Conversini, whose strong ties to the Franciscan order are obviously evident, repeatedly exalts in the Rationarium his compassionate and soft nature. Significantly, he attributes this trait to the impact of women on him. Following the early death of his mother, his uncle entrusted him to the care of nuns in a convent or an orphanage in Ravenna. Growing up amid nuns, according to Conversini, had a deep impact upon his character. This is a striking statement in chapter 44. I was no, sorry. This is the one from chapter 4. Therefore, no one should marvel that, having been raised in the midst of so many virgins consecrated to God, I grew up to be peaceful and soft, unable not only to perform, but also to behold any act of savagery, blood spilling, or cruelty. And the adjective mitis that Conversini uses here to describe his softness is an adjective that Petrarch often employs to describe his own emotional side. Over the course of his narration, Conversini often returns to his compassionate nature, describing no less than 3 times his deep sense of compassion, even towards the suffering of animals. And this is now from chapter 44. I was also endowed with a certain softness that is characteristic of compassionate minds, due to which I was not only unable to offend others, but was also filled with great sorrow over their injuries, so much so that I was even compassionate towards the brute beasts. His compassionate nature, strongly associated with the company of women, is thus a character trait Conversini is particularly proud of and considers as worthy of cultivation and imitation. Yet, this praise of soft-heartedness and compassion often runs counter to Conversini's elaboration on the perils of the customs of his day, particularly the tendency to spoil children and render them soft and effeminate. During the striking account of his years in grammar school, where he had to endure the sheer cruelty of various male schoolmasters, and this is a description that contrasts markedly with his blissful early upbringing in the convent. So Conversini describes how he finally decided to flee from one of his teachers and found himself in Florence. Lacking any means to support himself, he had to work as a servant at the household of Michele dei Medici. Alluding to his deep despair on account of this position of servitude, Conversini now declares that the fact that he was spoiled as a child, including by the nuns, whom he had recently praised, rendered him overly soft and effeminate, unable to withstand any difficulties whatsoever. Raising children in hardship and want and building their sturdy character, he asserts, is a much better path. And I'm quoting from chapter 17. This is why they seem to be wise, those who from the early stages of life habituate their children to hardships and the way of life of the common people, teaching them to endure inconveniences. Mentioning Seneca as his authority on the matter, Conversini brings up an array of exempla to support his argument, praising the harsh parental habits of the peoples of Scandinavia, the ancient Spartans, and Achilles' educator Chiron, as described in Statius' Achilleid. Such upbringing, he asserts, ensures steadfastness and virility in the face of the hardships of life. So just as in Book 17 of Petrarch Seniles, in which the humanist exalts the way the rustic upbringing of peasant Griselda made her resilient and strong, and then contrasts her sturdiness with the soft and compassionate response of the pattern reader of his tale, so Conversini Rationarium oscillates between an ideal of Stoic virility and a milder and tender view of the essence of humanity. And this is one thing I find striking about both Petrarchan and Conversini, how they constantly oscillate between these two poles. A central question that remains open by the end of the work is, where does Conversini place the onus of his humanist vision of self-care, whether in the cultivation of Stoic-like steadfastness and self-control, or Franciscan emotionality? Near the very end of the work, and with this I'm approaching the end of this talk, near the very end of the work, Conversini offers a highly moving description of a funeral of an anonymous woman who died during a pilgrimage to Rome. Encountering the woman on his way back from his embassy to the papal curia, Conversini describes a whole of pilgrims coming from all corners of Europe, united in compassion for the woman so as to give her proper burial, one characterized by simplicity and true feeling. And he writes, with how many tears, with how much compunction did I observe the Christian people, different from one another in language, nationality, and geographical position, united in such compassion on account of you. With how many sighs, groans, and sweetness of mind did I gather the rocks to erect a grave. And I think this is a striking example of the way Conversini imagines a type of a global community, in this sense, European and Christian, but one that comes together through, in essence, the bond of compassion. This is what brings them together. It is with this pathetic image, which circles back to his early praise of compassion in the description of his upbringing in the convent, he leaves us, his readers, clearly positing such pious emotionality as an ideal. The oscillation between the classical Stoic and the Franciscan-like visions of selfhood thus defines to a large degree Conversini's self-representation and emerges as another crucial tension characterizing the humanist care of the self in the work. So let me conclude. I tried to show in this presentation how Conversini's Rationarium offers us a prime example of the strong impact of the Petrarchan ethics of care of the self in the generation following Petrarch's death. By adhering to the Petrarchan care, Conversini's Rationarium highlights how early Italian humanism may be considered as a movement that offered a new type of ethics and a new mode of subjectivity in the later Middle Ages, one which revolved around the concern with the self within a secular and worldly setting. Like Petrarch, Conversini posits the care of the self as a central ethical task of the man of letters and employs autobiographical writing as a means to conduct such care. Further, like Petrarch, it posits its concern with the self as a mode of social critique. At the same time, Conversini's self-care is governed by various tension. His written self-examination, much more than Petrarch's, oscillates between Stoic and Augustinian modes of care, and is divided over the ends of care between the Stoic steadfastness and Franciscan softness. And how this humanist self-care, how this vision of self-care was absorbed and developed among other humanists of the period, as well as in the generations following Conversini, is worthy, I believe, of much further examination. So thank you very much for your attention. And let's turn to Bernhard.
Bravissimo, Gur, thank you very much. That was a brilliant talk, very, very stimulating. Maybe you could just quit sharing the presentation so we see each other more clearly, if you take it away.
Okay, to discover now how to do it.
Yeah, were you?
No, I'm used to Zoom, so this is very new. Okay.
There's a little bar
Sharing. I found it.
on the
Okay.
bottom or top of the page. Perfect. Thank you so much. That's great. So everybody can come in now, also with the webcams activated and so on. So I would now take a little advantage as your host and give you 2 or 3 questions before opening the discussion to the public. That was really very rich. And thank you so much. I mean, at the end, you touched some fundamental problems, I think, regarding the community building according to Petrarch's standards and according to what later writers and persons might have done. Perhaps one of my questions would concern Petrarch and his conception of reading texts, because as we know, for Petrarch, the analysis of oneself, any kind of sort of philosophical and religious self-care, that would always be closely connected with reading texts, including, of course, ancient texts as well. And I mean, in a way, Petrarch constructs his conception of community building on the lectura textus, so to speak. So Conversini, on the other hand, presents this, puts this quite differently at the beginning of the Rationarium, and you quoted what he mentions there as 2 forms of quite negative, clearly negative fixation on external things, which one should avoid. Namely, A was reading about the deeds of previous people, veterum gesta legere, and B was audire presentia, in the sense of reception, auditive reception of current actions and events. So what would you say? What status and importance does the reading of texts, say, for example, historiographical texts or moral philosophical texts, which are so important to Petrarch and to his conception of community building, actually have in Conversini's humanistic ideal? What's the importance of reading for Conversini? And okay, the question should be clear.
No, yeah, it's an important question, and you're right that in the opening statement, that's what he says. He says that reading the ancients is caring for outer things and not caring for yourself, really. And I think it touches upon another tension in the work, because there is another statement that I mentioned where Conversini specifically says that the study of letters is a means of care for him, is a way of self-cultivation. And we know that he was giving lectures on, for example, Valerius Maximus at various points, and the jest of the ancients in this sense. So I think what he says in the beginning, it's a way to move away from such practice of reading and focusing more on confession and prayer and things like that. But overall, when we read the Rationarium, I think it's quite obvious that reading is also very important to him, also as an ethical practice. That would be my take on that. And in sense of community building, obviously it forms a part of it. I mean, this commitment to antiquity, this is what important to them. And one thing, and you compared it to Petrarch, and I think it's interesting. And one thing I was thinking about when I read the text, and for Petrarch, community is about friendship, almost always. And he returns to this issue of friendship and wishing to build a community of friends, and they share everything. And I found it striking that Conversini doesn't talk very much about friends in the Rationarium. I don't know if you and others would agree with that, but I got this sense that it's really more an eternal kind of solitary experience that he has. And obviously, I need to think about it further, but I find that this aspect of friendship and the relationship of friendship and community is something that Conversini is less focused on than Petrarch. I don't know if it's answer your concerns or your question.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just I'm still thinking about his his idea of a community. This is really difficult to answer to me. Such a rather sort of solitary existence he's describing as an ideal is perhaps difficult to combine with the idea.
I think when you read it, you get a sense of really kind of an existential isolation that he has all the time, and he's in the core, troubled by those around him, and he can't trust anyone. He doesn't trust his uncle, obviously not his uncle's entourage. There are some friends like Paolo Rugolo and people like that supported him, but overall you get a sense that he's very isolated.
Yeah,
unlike Petrarch, who always. But I don't know. That's just the Rationarium. Maybe if we open the picture more, we will get other things.
Just one more question from my part. I would have more, but I wouldn't like to inhibit the public discussions, which we should begin. Perhaps isolation. Let's say something about the sexual dimension of this life. But you mentioned the role of women in that text. And so you talked about the role of women in the Rationarium, referring mainly to the nuns who raised little Giovanni so friendly and mildly and so on. But isn't the role of women in that text a little more complex and also less positive? I mean, Giovanni hates his first wife. He basically kills her. He says that himself. He kills her through his rejection and negligence. The second wife is judged a little better, but
much better, not a little better.
Okay, much better, but she's still really shown emotionally as purely positive. I'd say. Many other women who remain anonymous remain sex objects in a way to Giovanni. So what about the role of women in the relation between the sexes as portrayed by this text? It's also, is that a feature of his isolation, the relation to women, or how would you assess that?
That's a difficult one.
You brought in the gender.
Yeah, I know. And I do think that the mention of the nuns is very significant, and he has this very positive view of them and the way they influence his upbringing and his character, and compassion, which he associates with them, is important to him. And I find it interesting. At the same time, you're right that other women in the text don't fare as well. His first wife, we should say that he was married at 12. He was only 12. He got married, and it was imposed on him. So, and it didn't work, obviously. So that was a difficult experience for him. And the second wife, I found even moving at times, the description of the relationship. I don't think it's only negative, and he does appreciate the relationship that they had. And I think what's really in the background several times here is Boccaccio, and Boccaccio, I think specifically reflections on marriage, on women, but on marriage. And for example, in the Trattatello in Lode di Dante, where it gives a very negative view of marriage. And Conversini, he appears to leans towards such a view, but then he's not going all the way, and he's more sympathetic toward the idea of marriage and toward women. That was my impression when reading about his second marriage. And this is in a way unusual that he is an itinerant humanist, and he married twice, and he describes his various uncertainties about whether to get married again, and eventually was convinced. But overall, I think there's something interesting about the way that he's very solitary, engaged in self-care, but then also gives room to marriage. That was my impression.
Of course, you're right, and he does say in this text, but also in some other passages, things very interesting about marriage, where he says marriage is not a sexual adventure. A marriage is a partnership to
Mhm.
face as a couple the harshness and brutality of life, because life is always threatening. It's destroying you, and you need a partner to
Yeah,
face that. And
I think it's very interesting, and
the wife would be
maybe it's there.
it's a little nucleus
Yes,
of human community, and that's
yes,
what marriage is made for, in a way.
yes,
And I found this very interesting, because it's
yes.
not really typical of other Trecento texts I would have in
No,
mind.
it's
um,
it's in a way it seems to be moving towards like Aristotle's idea of marriage in the discussion of friendship in the ethics, right? It's something like that. It seems to be in the background. Yeah.